Bregt and I will be presenting the results of our survey on the strategic approaches to and research assessment of open science. But because there are so many of you with us today, I think it's worth giving a brief introduction to Science Europe and how this survey and activity came about and why it's an important topic to us. So we are the Association of Major National Research Funding and Performing Organizations in Europe. We have members, as you can see on this map, all around Europe, including, as examples, the German Research Foundation, the Estonian Research Council, and the Italian Institute for Nuclear Physics. We represent 29 countries who collectively contribute more than 25 billion euros to research each year. And we work across a number of different policy topics and contexts. And our work over the past 4 years has been guided by a strategy plan that focuses on 3 different priority areas. Firstly, shaping European research policy developments. Secondly, contributing to the evolution of research cultures. And thirdly, strengthening the role and contribution of science in tackling societal challenges. So today, the work we present here will focus on the second priority, on research cultures, where both our work on open science and research assessment sits. However, I think it's important to note that the results of this survey demonstrate quite clearly something that we've known for a couple of years now, and that is that we cannot have discussions on open science or research assessment in isolation, and that they should be viewed as cross-cutting topics that provide valuable insights and checks across all research policy topics and across all of our 3 strategic priorities. And that's one of the activities that both Bregt and I have been trying to engage in the last couple of years. This idea of interconnection between policy topics really nicely summarizes our understanding of research culture. And that it's all about making connections and looking at how the effects of interventions in one area and can have consequences and possible knock-on effects in another. And I think I like to refer back to this great diagram from the Royal Society in 2018 that captures the breadth and interconnectedness of the topics that we try to cover under the umbrella of research cultures. And I think, as you can see from this diagram, that's reflected in open science, in recognition systems, and I think importantly, in promoting and enabling behavior change in support of research quality and impact. And that is kind of the root of our work and the root of the rationale for this survey. So the survey report that we published today, as Lydia has already mentioned, came from an effort to bring together our activities on open science and research assessment, recognizing that they were mutually dependent on one another. And out of a joint meeting of our working groups last year came the idea for this project. Of course, I think it's important to emphasize that Science Europe is not the only organization or institute discussing these connections, and we've been really lucky to be able to build our survey and the concept for this project on many initiatives that have been working in similar ways. Just to name a couple, I think the UNESCO recommendation on open science, DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment, and the Open Science Policy Platform are all examples of bringing issues on open science and research assessment together. And I think we'll touch upon these again later in the webinar. So for the survey itself, we launched it in spring this year, and we were delighted to have such a high response rate from our members. 36 of 40 responding members provided input to this survey, and that was well balanced within our membership according to organization size and also to geographic location. You will see from the figure on the right-hand side that the vast majority of responding organizations were funding agencies, with 1 research performing organization responding and 3 respondents with a dual function as both a funding and performing organization. It's important to note that this is reflective of the Science Europe membership at large. But at the outset, then, I think it's also important that we note that these results are, and what we'll present today and what is in the survey report is firstly descriptive of a current status, and that it's reflective of the Science Europe membership being Europe in focus, and mostly, but not exclusively, of research funding organization positions. And I think with that, I can hand over to Bregt for the first section of the results.
Yes, thank you, James. Thank you for that introduction. Also, Lydia, thank you both. My name is Bregt Saenen. I'm Senior Policy Officer here at Science Europe for Open Science. And it's my pleasure to be the first to start digging in to the survey results, to start walking us through what we have learned from the survey that we've undertaken with our members. And the first section of the survey, results that we want to walk all of you through is the one on strategic approaches to open science. We first in the survey had a number of questions to our members about, do they have strategic approaches to open science in place? What is the content of those approaches? How do those approaches also contribute more broadly to the research culture that they are trying to shape? What are the challenges? What are the drivers? All of these are things that we asked. And just starting at the very start, the first question that we asked in the survey was, well, we asked all of our members, do you have a documented strategic approach in place, either on open science in general or any of its elements? And the immediate thing that pops out here, if you look at the findings, at the results that we got, was that almost all of our responding member organizations have some sort of strategic approach in place. At the bottom of this slide, one thing that you can see is that there is one responding organization that says, no, we don't have that in place yet, but we are planning to have one in the future. Every other organization says, yes, we have something in place. Most commonly, if you look at the top, most commonly, that means that the organization itself has a policy on open science or elements of open science in place, or even if you look at the third result there, is that yes, open science is part of that organization's mission, strategy, or vision document. So there's a clear focus there at the organizational level. But more than that, if you start looking through these results a little bit more, you also see that a lot of the responding organizations are flagging to us at the national or regional level, there are also open science policies that they follow. Those are also very much in place, and a little bit further behind, just below 50%, we are also getting the response that organizations follow international policies that are available out there. To make a little bit more sense of this, we also asked an open question where members could give us a little bit more information of how this actually works, and running through those comments, the responses we received there, and they're detailed a little bit more in the report, but for now I can tell you that going through the comments of our responding member organizations, again and again, we see that this is a story of interaction between these different elements. This is a story of alignment between these different levels. Our organizations, our members, are saying we are not doing this in isolation. We are doing this within a framework of policies that exist across these different levels, and we very closely align and interact with our partners, especially within the regional and national level. So that's the first question we asked. That's the first result that we got, that yes, these approaches, strategic approaches, are fully in place. The obvious next question that we asked them is, well, what is included here? What is included within these strategic approaches? And there we got the following result. This is quite a slide to unpack, but it falls apart in three different parts, and I'll walk you through that now. If you look at the top right corner of the results here, what you see, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that there is a strong emphasis on what we have called in the report the traditional elements of open science. That means open access to specifically research articles, but also research data, also open access to research books. So open access to research outputs, those are sort of the traditional elements that are understood within the banner of open science. And you see that there's a strong emphasis on those elements within the strategic approaches that our members have in place. That's sort of the top right corner. The other interesting thing, if you then start looking further down, start looking at the other elements of this graph, of this result, is that open science also very clearly goes beyond just open access. It is starting to mean a lot more than open access to research outputs. If you look at the middle section of this graph, you see that within the strategic approaches, our members are saying we are also including their open research infrastructure. We are including stakeholder engagement with partners in society. We are including open source research software, code, and tools. We are including citizen science. That is sort of our first indication there. It's not quite 50%, sort of up to 50% of the responding organizations say we are going beyond the more traditional elements of open science. There are these emerging elements that are slowly but surely coming up there. And that is, I think, a very interesting finding. It's also, if you go further down, you see the bottom left of the slide, you see a couple of more of these emerging elements that are less often included. That's sort of up to a quarter of the responding members, up to 25%. But very interesting, you see there that going well beyond open access to research outputs, open evaluation, open research methods, you see that 8 and 7 of the responding organizations are saying this is now also part of our strategic approach. Open science is starting to mean quite a lot more than just open access, even though there's still quite naturally a strong focus on those traditional elements. One thing I should say about this slide is that this is, as my colleague James said, this is a descriptive report. These are descriptive findings. What does it actually mean to have these elements included in a strategic approach? That is something that we are going to be unpacking with our members in these member workshops that we're organizing next year. That could mean different things. It could mean that something is included being mentioned as important within an approach. It could mean that there's an active policy on some of these elements. Being included within a strategic approach can mean different things. That is one of the things we're looking forward to unpacking further with our members. But for now, I think this gives us a very good starting point to look at what actually is meant if our members say we have an approach to open science in place. So good start. We know the responding members have strategic approaches in place. We know by and large what is included there. The next couple of questions that we had took a slightly different approach to open science. We started in the next questions looking at open science as a means to an end, as asking our members, how do you then see the connection between open science and the broader research culture? How do you see the contribution of open science to the broader research culture? And we asked that in the following way. We asked, what are sort of the values behind open science? What type of values are you trying to hold here when you work on open science? How is this good for research and the research culture in general? And what immediately jumps out here from this result is that the connection that our members make between open science and these values is very clearly focused on research quality and integrity and collective benefit, which is essentially research impact. Our members are saying here, that is the connection we're making. Open science, policies and practices, we see that as beneficial to research quality, integrity, research impact. That is a clear connection that is being made by about 75% of responding organizations. A little bit further down, not too much, but a little bit further down, you see that there's also a connection being made between open science and equity and fairness, and even diversity and inclusiveness. So basically the EDI elements, those connections are less pronounced, but they're also being made. I should be very clear that this result is about the connection specifically with open science and these values. We know from other surveys that we have done here at Science Europe that our members are very active on equity, on fairness, diversity, and inclusiveness. They're very active in those fronts. What we're seeing here is that the connection between those values and open science is not as pronounced as the connection between research quality and impact. So that's already very interesting to see how those connections are being made. One last note, I think on this slide specifically, it's something that we detail a little bit more in the report is, you see here also, we have to mention this, is that this is a very, very European perspective. All the organizations surveyed are working within Europe. One thing that might be very interesting in the future is to ask these types of questions also beyond Europe. How research organizations outside of Europe, in the global south, how they would make those connections between open science and these values. That might ultimately gather very different results. We don't know that, but it's one of the things that we are interested in exploring in the future with our global partners. A second question we asked on this front is what type of goals are being pursued with open science? If our members are working on open science, and what type of goals are they pursuing with those policies and practices? It confirms the close connection with research quality. Up top there, you see transparency, scrutiny, critique, and reproducibility. Those are things that sort of confirm the connection with the contribution to research quality. But also we should say there is a wide variety of goals being pursued with open science. You see there especially sort of collaboration, responsibility, equality of opportunities. These are all goals that our members are connecting to their work on open science. Next up, we have a couple of more questions on strategic approaches. Next up, we started asking then about what are the primary drivers for your strategic approaches and their development and implementation, and what are some of the challenges that you face in developing and implementing your approaches. First up, we asked about, well, what are the primary drivers that you would identify in developing your approaches? And we got the following result. What we see here, especially up top, is that our member organizations are saying we have our own mandate. We have our own mandate to develop our strategic approaches. Your own organization is the most popular option indicated there. They are in charge of their own strategic approach. But at the same time, not far behind, you see national ministries, national policies, and even international organizations are also a part of the equation here. Those are primary drivers identified in the development of these strategic approaches. We've seen that previously when we heard in sort of the open question from our members, like, this is a story about interaction between these different levels. It's a story about alignment across the different levels. These approaches are taking shape. A second thing that I should say about this result, something that struck us when we saw it, is that comparatively, you have a much lower recognition of the research community as a primary driver behind these strategic approaches. Now, again, this is a descriptive report. We don't know what's going on here exactly, but we do see that the identification of the research communities as primary drivers, that really jumps down. We need to look at that more closely. We are also very keen on maybe seeing if this is a shared view with other research organizations. How would universities, for example, feel about this? We would also be very keen on asking research communities themselves, like, do you share that view that you are not driving these strategic approaches? It's something that's noticeable, but we'll have to unpack it further with our members and with other research actors to get to the bottom of what exactly is being said here. Then, quite a big slide. coming up, we asked about the challenges that our members face in terms of how they develop and implement their strategic approaches. We asked that question twice, and we got the following result. If you look at this, you look at what are like the biggest challenges identified by our members. Up top, you see that financial concerns is by far clearly the biggest challenge that is being identified by the members. And not far behind, sort of on average, you see that concerns over impact on researchers and impact on researchers and their careers, those are big challenges on the minds of our members in terms of how they develop and implement their approaches to open science. There is a wide variety of other challenges being identified as well, but one thing I'll point out here is that we asked this question twice for a specific reason. James and I, we said, well, we want to ask this twice. We want to know if there's a substantial difference in the results between the development phase and the implementation phase. Would we see substantial differences? If you look at this sort of like from afar, I don't think that has really materialized. I think it's sort of both in the development and implementation phase, the challenges are sort of in line with each other. There's no huge substantial differences, with a couple of exceptions where you can see that in the implementation phase, some challenges do jump forward a little bit. You can see that, for example, with monitoring in third place. And further down, you can see that with resistance from the research community jumps forward in the implementation phase, technical complexity, lack of awareness and or knowledge among the research community, and also lack of capacity in the organization itself. Those are a couple that really jump forward in the implementation phase as a challenge. Again, noticeable, think back of the previous finding we had, resistance from the research community and lack of awareness of the research community. Again, it's sort of a hint that there is something there that we need to explore further. What is actually being said here? That is something that we're going to be unpacking with our members in the future. I have one more slide before I hand it back over to my colleague James. Our last question on strategic approaches, we asked, do you have any plans to review your strategic approaches? How static are these approaches? Do you review them? Overwhelming majority of the members says, yes, we do have plans to review this. This is either occasionally or on a rolling basis, but the overwhelming majority of members say, yes, we do review this in sort of, in a time frame. One thing that I should definitely point out there, we had an open question connected to this question. We asked, give us a little bit more information. If you review your strategic approaches, what are you actually doing? What are you focusing on? And there's two things reading through that struck us as sort of a common thread between the different comments is, first, the responding members say that when they review their approaches, this is about broadening, making more ambitious their approach. They're giving us that information saying, if we review this, typically we start to add more of these emerging elements. We become a bit more broad in how we look at open science. We become a little bit more ambitious each time. That is something that we are focused on in the review process. A second thing that was also very, very noticeable is that a lot of the members say that even though it's about broadening the approach, there is also an element of re-evaluating the traditional elements, their approach to the traditional elements. We saw that in a previous slide, open access to research outputs. There is a clear focus also on evaluating how they approach those traditional elements. We don't have time to go into that for this presentation. There's more details in the report. But I think that anyone here on the call that is sort of working on open science is aware of this, knows that this is a story of the current models of open access and how sustainable they are going into the future. It's a story of the current APC model and which alternative models might be more sustainable to take us forward in the future. That is one thing that our members are very clearly telling us, that yes, that is something that we are actively evaluating in these review processes. That's it for the first batch of findings. I know this was a lot to unpack. I hope I sort of managed to get you through this in one piece. And then I think I can hand it back over to my colleague James, who is continuing with research assessment.
Thank you, Bregt. So now I turn to research assessment of open science activities. So this can be viewed as the practical implementation of some of the open science positions and strategies that Bregt just presented. Assessment processes exert huge influence over the ways that research is conceived, conducted, and communicated, and therefore they're a key lever when trying to push for systemic change. The first section of this part of the survey focuses on the open science elements included in the funding requirements for funded projects, and therefore was answered by our members with funding capacities. Over half of responding organizations told us that they include requirements on elements of open science universally across all of their funding programs. And a further quarter of responding organizations include them across some of their funding programs. We had 4 of our responding organizations mentioning that they do not include any requirements on open science currently, and they do not plan to add them in the future. And in each of these cases, they reported to us that they instead rely on mechanisms such as guidance, incentives, and recommendations rather than requirements. So again, this shows the near universal incorporation of open science within research assessment processes by funding organizations. So looking into the elements of open science that are included as part of these funding requirements, and here I think we can see a familiar pattern to the one that Bregt had presented previously, in that only open access to research articles and fair data practices are currently recognized by more than 50% of the organizations that we surveyed. Open access to research books follows closely. But currently other elements of open science are only recognized by few responding organizations. So this familiar pattern, when comparing open science requirements to those mentioned in strategic documents, highlights some degree of coherence between the strategic approaches to open science on one side by responding organizations and then their practical implementation through the assessment processes that they use. We then looked at the ways in which information is collected at the application stage on these variety of elements of open science, and we can see that there are clearly different approaches taken by organizations. The results highlight firstly that more traditionally considered elements of open science, as Bregt mentioned, those around open access to publications, books, and research data, are those that are more likely to have information collected on them according to dedicated criteria within the application processes. More commonly, information is collected through dedicated questions and sections, and this is particularly the case, as seen in this slide, for research data. And I think here that is maybe a signal of the work that's been done over the last decade on research data management plans and sustainable data management. And finally, and in line with the move towards more qualitative assessments of research proposals, so the principles seen in DORA and more recently as a commitment within Kawara, that this information can, that qualitative assessment can broaden the range of open science elements that are then included when they're described as part of narrative descriptions or evidence-based approaches to evaluation. So I think there's a clear contrast between more active means of information collection, either through dedicated criteria or specific questions, applied to more traditional elements of open science and more passive methods through narrative descriptions applied to the broader range of open science activities that we see in this figure. And this is something that I think we will want to explore further as we take this project forwards. We also asked about the types of guidance provided to applicants and some degree of support on how to include or describe open science activities is provided by the vast majority of the organizations we surveyed. Most commonly, guidance documents are made available to prospective applicants, but things like staff support, tools and platforms, either in the form of help desks, information sessions or webinars, are also commonly reported. Outside of the options that we provided in the survey, the covering of costs for open access was also mentioned by several organizations as a form of support provision. But I think it's noteworthy here that support covers a wide range of activities and is not just limited to cost covering. Our next section then looked at the recognition of open science activities as part of researcher recognition processes. So here, meaning the track record assessment of individuals, either during funding allocation assessments or in career progression exercises. So this section applies to both research funding and research performing organizations. And the results here show that there are a diversity of approaches to open science during track record assessments. A quarter of the organizations that we surveyed include assessment of open science elements across all of their programs. About half of organizations do not include open science in their assessments of a researcher's track record, and around a quarter include them, but only for some of their programs or exercises. So I think this result contrasts with the extensive inclusion of open science in funding requirements for research projects, and may be the result of the different types of assessment that we're talking about in these instances. So, for instance, ex ante for the assessment of research projects, and ex post for the assessment of researcher track records. But again, this is something that we would like to explore further in our next activities. And once again, we see this familiar pattern, but in this case, much less pronounced. So most commonly recognized elements are still open access to research articles and books and research data. But interestingly, we see a much higher recognition of many other elements of open science. And I think this can be at least partly explained if we go to the next slide in how information is collected on these open science elements. So again, dedicated criteria are mostly reserved for publications and data, but there are more cases here where specific questions are used to collect information on a broader set of open science activities. But most pronounced is the role of narrative descriptions for collecting this kind of information. And I think this shows the utility of narrative approaches as a means of broadening the types of activity that are recognized in assessment processes, here applied to open science, but I think also something that within the context of Quora can be applied to many of the skills, competencies, and activities and contributions that we see from researchers as part of the modern research endeavor. And again, for support measures, a similar trend. All organizations provide some level of support, and many provide multiple types. Again, guidance documents are most common, but so are tools and platforms and support staff. Specific training is provided by just over a quarter of the organizations that we surveyed. And I think to close this section on research assessment, we also asked about plans for further changing and adapting approaches And here we heard that over 2/3 of responding organizations said they had plans to review and update their policies and practices towards open science in the coming years, with many citing Kawara as a driver for these reviews. And I think here I'll hand back to Bregt for the next section.
Yes, thank you, James. Back to me for the last two parts of the survey. We've seen quite a lot on strategic approaches. We've just seen how this is implemented through research assessment. But in the survey, we also asked a number of questions about open science monitoring done by our member organizations and evidence gathering for open science done by our members. Now, the reasons we asked this are quite clear, that as we can see that open science research assessment reform, this is becoming more widespread, these policies and practices, this is becoming more ambitious. The monitoring of that and the evidence gathering for that are also then obviously going to become more important in the future. Monitoring here first, meaning the information gathering related specifically to these open science processes and the policies of the responding members. A couple of questions that we asked there. First off, again, starting at the start, is we asked the organizations, do you have an open science monitoring mechanism in place? A large majority has one in place already, an even larger majority has one in place or plans to develop one in the future. I think that's a strong start. Our members are monitoring their open science policies and practices. An obvious second question then after that is, well, which elements of open science are actually being monitored at this point? And we get this result. And as my colleague James already said a couple of times, we are seeing a very familiar pattern come back again and again. And here it is a very pronounced pattern even. It's the traditional elements, open access to a number of research outputs, research articles, research data. That is very clearly being monitored. In the case of research articles, almost universally, that is being monitored. After that, there is a drop. Other sort of emerging elements of open science, you can see that it's much more pronounced in the drop as to like how little they are being monitored in comparison to those traditional elements. So that is also something very, very interesting to see that pattern come back and be very pronounced in this case. We asked also in terms of monitoring, what are the purposes? What do you use this monitoring data for once you have collected it? Quite a variety of purposes, basically investigate changes over time, guide policy development, compliance assessment, evaluation, implementation of support measures. All of these are close to or over 75% of the members saying these are some of the purposes that we use this monitoring data for. One thing that we found very noticeable in this result is that the monitoring information is used predominantly for internal purposes. All the purposes I just read out for 75% and more, those are internal purposes, what that is being used for. The drop you then see for the last two, communication towards individual disciplines, institutions, scholars, communication towards external parties, negotiating with publishers, sort of external facing. Monitoring data is not used for those purposes. That is, I think, one thing that we see. We need to unpack this a little bit further, but that is clearly something that you see, is that the internal purposes, those are the most popular purposes that are indicated by the members. A bit of a side quest we had, a bit of a side question we had at the end of monitoring that we also asked is, does your organization make openly available the research information, or sometimes called metadata, that it produces? That is a question that I think for the people who know the Barcelona Declaration, they'll know where this comes from. The Barcelona Declaration was just being launched as we were developing the survey. So we felt it was very interesting to also ask this at the end of the monitoring section. to what extent our organizations, our members are leading by example here, to what extent they make openly available that research information. A large majority indicates that yes, we do that for some of the research information that we produce, but only a very small minority does it for all the research information that they produce. Again, so the first time we asked this, it's the first time we're getting this result. It's very interesting to see, but it is something to be discussed further with the members, how they arrive at this point, what some of the challenges that they face. But just to already give you this results in terms of openly available research information. And then finally, just before the end, and we're finally almost through the survey results, the evidence gathering on open science, what is happening there. We had a couple more questions there, just also in terms of evidence gathering. The first one we asked again, is this something that your organization works on? And there, I think almost immediately you can see in terms of commissioning, funding, or performing evidence gathering activities, this is clearly something that is much less common in comparison to, for example, monitoring. We see about a third of the responding organizations saying, yes, we do perform evidence gathering activities, but at the same time, we also have a quarter of the responding members saying, no, we don't do any of this, and we also don't have any plans to do this. So clearly, this is sort of much less common on the agenda of our members. We also asked, what is the purpose of this type of evidence gathering? If you are active in this sense, then what type of purpose do you pursue with this? Well, there's very little differentiation here. Evidence gathering, guiding policy development, implementation of supporting measures, including research assessment. And these are all purposes that are indicated by the members. The report does have more information on this. We had an open question asking our members, like, detail this a little bit more for us, give us a little bit more of an insight here. All of that is included in the report. I will say one thing that we found quite consistently, both for monitoring and evidence gathering activities, one thing that was missing from those replies is an international dimension. Monitoring and evidence gathering seems to take place at the organizational level and maximum up to sort of the national level. It is within a national setting that this does take place, working with, for example, national bodies, but an international dimension seems to be largely absent in these replies, something to explore further. We do know that there are initiatives being developed right now to take on that international dimension, making this information internationally comparable in the future. But right now we see that this is absent by and large from the agendas of our members. That was the last question we asked. That was the last result that we have. I'm very happy now to hand it back over to my colleague, James.
Thank you. Yeah, so some very brief and descriptive conclusions, but I would like to just draw your attention back to the survey report, where there is a more thorough set of conclusions that you can read. And just to say that, as Lydia mentioned at the start, this is not really the end of the project. It's more of a beginning of a deeper dive. So the findings of this survey demonstrate that Science Europe members are actively shaping and contributing to the developments on open science, and there is some shared directionality in that. There is also common ground on the drivers for change, as well as the numerous challenges faced. We believe that these results provide a firm basis for more detailed discussions, and they'll hopefully contribute to mutual learning between our members, between research organizations, both funders and performing organizations at large. They will hopefully contribute to promoting alignment where it may be beneficial, and also contribute to policy and practice evolution more generally. We also hope that these results will provide a useful perspective to international policy discussions, particularly those taking place within COARA, at the European Research Area Forum, and at global forums such as UNESCO as well. And we will be doing our part to share these and engage in discussions at these levels. So then just briefly, as mentioned right at the beginning by Lydia, this is part of a wider project that will see us try to build a more comprehensive understanding of the roles of research organizations in advancing open science and promoting more open and effective research cultures. And early next year, we'll be organizing membership workshops to delve into specific elements of the results. We will also be launching a tender for information for a project that will look at the academic context of these survey outcomes with a particular focus on the intersection between open science and research culture evolution. So please look out for that launch in the coming weeks. It will be on the same web page that we have launched this survey report on. And then to close, I'd just like to go back to the start and our clarification that this survey is reflective of a European perspective. It's reflective of a Science Europe member perspective, but we hope that these questions are of broader interest, and we'd be delighted to broaden the scope of our discussions. As a first step in that, we've included the full survey in the annex of the report, so interested organizations can take those questions and adapt and use them in their own context. We'd love to hear from you if you do that, and we'd be more than happy to compare and discuss results with you.